Alright, so here's a story I never thought I'd be telling, at least not on the internet. But it's been a couple of years since that wild night, and I've been itching to share it. I worked the night shift as a security guard for one of those sprawling industrial parks just outside of Atlanta. You know the type, long stretches of warehouses, cold concrete everywhere, and the occasional raccoon skulking around. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Well, most of them. Barely. It was a Tuesday night, dead quiet. I had the radio turned low, static humming between classic rock tracks. My booth was this tiny little cube with windows on all sides, so I had a full view of the empty parking lot bathed in those weird orange sodium lights. I'd been trying to stay awake, sipping cold coffee from a thermos that was older than I'd like to admit, when I saw it. A car. Not just any car. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom, gliding in like it was floating on air. I actually sat up straight, my brain doing this weird double take because cars like that don't just roll into places like this. Not at 2 a.m., not ever. The car stopped right in front of my booth. For a second, I thought maybe I was about to get robbed. My heart was doing this nervous tap dance as the driver's door opened. Out stepped a man, mid-40s, tall, with sharp features and the kind of suit that probably cost more than my yearly rent. His dark hair was slicked back, and his shoes, man, those shoes were shinier than the moon. He walked up to my booth, gave me this polite nod, and said, "Good evening." His voice was smooth, like he'd practiced charming people his whole life. Good evening," I stammered, trying to sound professional while also wondering why the hell he was here. He smiled, reaching into his pocket, and for one terrifying second, I thought he was pulling a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick envelope and slid it through the slot in the glass. "This is for you," he said, his tone calm but firm. I stared at the envelope like it was a ticking time bomb. What is it?" $10,000, he said, like it was no big deal. "Cash." I blinked. I don't understand." "Why?" "Let's just say I'm paying it forward," he replied. "You look like you could use a break." He wasn't wrong. I was drowning in debt, my car was on its last legs, and I hadn't been able to afford health insurance in years. But still, this felt surreal. Like, who does this? "Are you serious?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. His smile widened. "Dead serious. Take it. No strings attached." I hesitated, but eventually, my hand reached for the envelope. It was heavier than I expected. When I opened it, my eyes almost popped out of my skull. Stacks of crisp $100 bills stared back at me. Before I could say anything else, he glanced at his watch and said, "I've got to run, but I hope this helps. Take care of yourself, alright?" And just like that, he got back in his car and drove off, the taillights disappearing into the night. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the envelope clutched in my hands, wondering if I'd just dreamed the whole thing. Spoiler alert, I hadn't. That night changed everything. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I walked into my bank, clutching that envelope like it was made of gold. The teller, a young guy named Kevin who always looked half asleep, blinked in surprise when I handed it to him. How can I help you?" he asked, glancing at the envelope like it might bite him. "I need to deposit this," I said, trying to sound casual even though my hands were shaking. When Kevin opened it and saw the cash, his eyes widened. "You serious?" "Dead serious," I replied, echoing the mysterious man's words from the night before. It felt surreal watching Kevin count out the bills. $10,000. Just like that, my overdraft was gone. My credit card debt wiped out. For the first time in years, I had breathing room. I'd been living paycheck to paycheck, always one step away from disaster. Now, for the first time, I felt free. But I didn't stop there. That night, I sat down at my rickety kitchen table with a pen, a notepad, and a determination I hadn't felt in years. I made a plan. Step 1, fix my car. Step 2, start an emergency fund. Step 3, figure out how to never end up in that kind of financial hole again. Over the next few weeks, my life started to shift. I got my old Honda repaired, finally replacing the bald tires and fixing the brake issue that had been making my commutes a white-knuckle experience. I paid off the last of my medical bills, which had been haunting me since I'd broken my arm a few years back. And for the first time in years, I took a deep breath without feeling the crushing weight of debt on my chest. But the biggest change came when I decided to invest in myself. I'd always been interested in finance, not that I'd ever had much money to manage. I started reading books, watching videos, and learning everything I could about trading and investing. It became an obsession, but in the best way possible. Every spare moment I had, I was learning. And slowly but surely, I started to see results. By the end of that year, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. If you told me a year earlier that I'd become a trader, I'd have laughed in your face. But there I was, sitting in my modest but comfortable apartment, monitoring stock charts on a second-hand laptop while sipping a cup of coffee that didn't taste like desperation. Life was different now. The first few months were rocky. I lost money, not a lot, but enough to make me question whether I was cut out for this. Still, I pushed through, learning from every mistake. I kept my night shift job for a while, using the quiet hours to study. Eventually, though, I started seeing consistent gains. Nothing massive, but enough to make me realize I could actually make this work. One of the most surreal moments came when I bought my first real car. I'd been driving that beat-up Honda for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to sit in something new. The day I drove home in a shiny, slightly used Toyota Camry, I felt like I was on top of the world. My neighbors even stopped to compliment me, which was a first. But it wasn't just the material things. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my life. I got health insurance. I started saving for retirement. I even began helping my sister, who was struggling with student loans. It felt good to give back, especially knowing how much people had helped me along the way. One day, while scrolling through my email, I got a message that made my heart skip a beat. It was from a trading platform I'd been using, inviting me to speak at a local event. Me. A guy who, a year ago, couldn't afford a decent pair of shoes. Now, they wanted me to share my story. I almost declined, thinking I wasn't qualified. But then I thought about that man in the Rolls-Royce, how he believed in me without even knowing me. Maybe it was time to pay it forward. The event was nerve-wracking but incredible. I spoke about my journey, from that fateful night in the security booth to my budding career as a trader. People came up to me afterward, thanking me for inspiring them. It was overwhelming but in the best way possible. And then, the craziest thing happened. As I was packing up to leave, I noticed a familiar figure standing at the back of the room. It was him. The man in the suit. The one who'd handed me that envelope all those months ago. My heart raced as he walked up to me, that same calm smile on his face. "Looks like you've been busy," he said, extending a hand. I shook it, barely able to contain my excitement. "You have no idea. I don't even know how to thank you." "You've already thanked me," he replied, gesturing to the crowd. "By doing exactly what you're doing. Keep it up." We exchanged numbers that day, and over time, we became friends. His name was Richard, and as I got to know him, I realized he wasn't just some millionaire throwing money around. He genuinely cared about helping people. He'd been in my shoes once, struggling to make ends meet, and someone had helped him. Now, he was paying it forward, one person at a time. Our friendship started simply. Richard would call me every now and then, usually to check in and see how I was doing. At first, I was nervous. After all, this guy was on a whole different level. But the more we talked, the more I realized how down-to-earth he was. He wasn't just some aloof millionaire, he was genuinely curious about my life, my goals, and how I was navigating this new world of financial independence. One day, he invited me to lunch. We met at this upscale bistro in downtown Atlanta, the kind of place where the servers wear crisp white shirts and the water glasses are always full. I felt a little out of place in my off-the-rack suit, but Richard didn't seem to care. Over a plate of seared salmon, he shared more about his life. He'd grown up in a working-class family, just like me. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a schoolteacher. Money had always been tight, and he'd learned the value of hard work early on. His big break had come when he'd met a mentor, an older businessman who saw potential in him and gave him a chance. "He didn't just give me money," Richard said, his voice thoughtful. "He gave me knowledge. That's what changed my life. And that's why I do what I do. It's not about the money, it's about giving people the tools to change their own lives." That conversation stuck with me. It made me think about how I could do more, not just for myself but for others. Over the next few months, I started mentoring a few people who were just starting out in trading. I'd host small workshops in my apartment, teaching them the basics of investing and financial literacy. It felt amazing to see them grow, to watch that spark of hope ignite in their eyes. One day, Richard surprised me with an invitation. He was throwing a birthday party at his estate, a sprawling property just outside the city, complete with manicured gardens, a pool that looked like something out of a luxury magazine, and even a small vineyard. "You have to come," he said over the phone. "It's going to be a great time." I hesitated. A part of me still felt like I didn't belong in his world. But another part of me knew that this was more than just a party. It was a chance to celebrate how far I'd come, to step fully into this new chapter of my life. As the date approached, I found myself feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. What would I say to all these people? How would they see me? But then I thought about everything Richard had taught me, not just about money, but about believing in myself. When the day finally arrived, I drove up to Richard's estate in my Camry, the car gleaming under the afternoon sun. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, each one more expensive than the last. I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and stepped out, ready to face whatever came next. The moment I stepped into Richard's estate, I felt like I'd walked into a different world. The place was stunning, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Guests in designer outfits mingled around the grand living room, glasses of champagne in hand. For a second, I felt out of place, but then I spotted Richard making his way toward me. "John," he exclaimed, his face lighting up with a warm smile. He pulled me into a quick, friendly hug. "I'm so glad you made it." "Thanks for inviting me," I said, trying not to gawk at the sheer opulence of the place. Richard led me around, introducing me to some of his friends. They were an eclectic mix, entrepreneurs, artists, even a couple of philanthropists. Despite their high status, they were surprisingly welcoming. Richard had a way of making everyone feel at ease, and it was clear that his friends admired him not just for his wealth but for his character. At one point, Richard pulled me aside to the balcony. The night air was cool, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. He handed me a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his tone more serious now. "You've come a long way, John. I'm proud of you." Hearing those words hit me harder than I expected. "I couldn't have done it without you," I admitted. That night, it changed everything for me. Richard shook his head. "You did the work. I just gave you a nudge. And now, look at you, mentoring others, building a future. That's what it's all about." We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation sinking in. Then, Richard gave me a sly smile. "So, any big plans for the future?" I grinned. "Plenty. I want to expand the workshops, maybe even start a non-profit to teach financial literacy to underprivileged communities. I feel like it's my turn to pay it forward.